Hi, it's Mark Coopersmith. And in my ongoing series of conversations with innovators, entrepreneurs, change makers around the world, it's a distinct pleasure for me right now to spend some time with Pascal Finette. Pascal, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sharing some thoughts with all of us.
Mark, I'm super excited to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, well, I think we'll have some fun. I think that's exactly right. So Pascal is the chair of all things entrepreneurial and open innovation at Singularity University. So that's a broad purview, and is also the co-founder at Be Radical, which really helps organizations create greater capabilities to drive positive change, to deal with all these disruptions that we're seeing certainly in these days. And Pascal, I probably didn't get all of that right. So please share just a little bit more about that context, and then we'll get into our conversation.
You got it pretty well set up, I think. So the very short version is I'm an entrepreneur by heart and training. I've built a bunch of companies myself, have been part of some of the more interesting internet companies in their formative years, eBay in the early 2000s, Google, Mozilla, Firefox. But really what I'm particularly fascinated by is the future and how the future affects us, particularly on the business side. And then the specific angle or lens we're putting on this, and this is probably the German nature in me, is I like to simplify these things down to very practical advice. And so we share that advice with company leaders and entrepreneurs all around the world.
Right. Well, clearly you have not been a McKinsey consultant then.
I leave that without comment.
So I love the idea of simplifying, right? I mean, you have to distill it down to its essence. And then from there, from an execution or other standpoint, of course, we go ahead and we put the layers on to go ahead and execute and build it out from there. So let's look, by the way, before we started recording, Pascal and I were sharing, some common experiences. And it was like, and I'll date myself here, it was like that scene from the movie Jaws, where all of the experienced sea captains are talking about how the great shark almost got them. And they're rolling up their sleeves or showing the scars on their legs. And we have those, whether it's startups or whether it's launching ventures inside Fortune 100 companies. So it's great to be spending some time with a fellow traveler.
I love it. Yes. Nice picture.
Yeah. So let's look to the future.
Hmm.
We're in the midst of COVID-19 right now on a global basis. There's so much new technology that's been emerging and accelerating in so many ways. When we take a look at what trends are shaping the future, when you start to incorporate in the lens that you use, in the way that you engage with companies and entrepreneurs and leaders globally, first of all, how do you help all of us get a better view of what the future looks like, what we can see, and maybe what's around the corner?
For me, it starts with an insight which will not surprise you, which is to really state that the future is invisible. And the other part about the future is that the future is unwritten. So it's really on us to create that future. So everybody who tells you like they know what the future will look like, they lie to you. They just don't know. But you combine this with what my colleague Paul Saffo, who teaches over at Stanford, and my apologies for bringing up that name here. But Paul uses a framing where he talks about what is called the cone of uncertainty. So the idea is that the further out you go into the future, the wider your option space becomes. And in the option space, you look at what is the space of the possible and what is the space of the probable. And you can actually determine those two relatively well when you look at least predictable technology changes, etc. I mean, COVID clearly is a little bit more of an unpredictable event, which has happened to us.
So how do you handicap possible versus probable?
Well, the possible is you look at what is even technological, for example, possible, right? Like this gives you the whole sphere. When we look at the probable, you want to take into account the Germans have a beautiful word, they call this Gestalt. And Gestalt is the holistic view of everything. So you need to not just look at the technological capabilities, but you want to look at what are the other factors which either need to be true or need to be removed for a technology to be successful. I'll give you a simple example. If you think about way back when our friends from Netflix created the streaming service, one of the questions they needed to ask themselves in the Gestalt framework is broadband internet penetration, because if you don't have broadband, you can't watch Netflix. And that limits your your cone, right? Like you shrink your cone from what could we possibly do in terms of sending out these movies into the ether versus what does the probable cone look like of the customers who even have enough bandwidth to watch all that stuff.
So the fascinating thing there, of course, as we know, they started sending DVDs by mail with the vision,
Indeed.
obviously Netflix, that it would become a net-based or an internet-based distribution platform. So that's seeing beyond what's currently possible or
Hmm.
currently probable into what might be possible.
That's right, yeah. And the futurist community, which we are very close with, has this framework around what they call weak signals. So
Right.
the idea is you look at these interesting, typically pretty mediocre in its implementation and quality signs of what could be. And if you think about Netflix, way before Netflix started doing their first streaming, we had internet streaming. It wasn't
Right.
like a new thing, right? Like Mark Cuban famously made a whole lot of money
Right.
selling a very mediocre version of streaming, at least from today's perspective.
Yes, that's right.
So you can, right? You can see these weak signals, and then I think it's on us. The imperative on us as leaders, as entrepreneurs, is to figure out which of those weak signals actually will become strong signals, and in which time frames, and what needs to be done to get them there.
Okay, I love that. When I think about the future and technology, I mean, it's interesting because some of the quotes that I love around this come from science fiction. And science
Hmm.
fiction writer William Gibson kind of famously wrote, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." So when you take a look at what you're talking about, when Netflix was created, there were, especially in Silicon Valley, where I'm beaming from, there were some of those early networks that were in
Hmm.
place, but they weren't evenly distributed. So you could start to see the future.
That's right. And I think there's an interesting wrinkle to this because a lot of people, when they quote the William Gibson quote, which I love, by the way, um, consider it as the future is, you can see the future today if you have the money for it. You know, like to your point, like in Silicon Valley, we had some high-speed networks that were like very exclusive, etc.
Yeah, our
I think
Teslas
there's
per capita are super high here too,
yeah,
right? I
right,
mean, and a
exactly.
number of other things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And the Tesla is, like what? Like a $45,000 car at the lowest, or
At the
40,000,
lowest, on a
whatever it
hundred and
is.
twenty-five thousand dollar car, the way most of them are driving up and down
Right.
around, Sand Hill
Exactly.
Road in Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think there's a second part to this, which is you can also see the weak signals speaking to you in on the cheap and abundant side. And here's an interesting example. This came out about 2 weeks ago, and just as a reference, we're at the end of September, so people have a frame of reference here. When we are writing the year 2020, at least I believe it is still 2020. But here's the thing. So a couple of weeks ago, someone took a pregnancy test, a digital pregnancy test, and tore it apart because the person was interested in what is the technology in there. They found that there's a chip in there and a little sensor, an image sensor. And what it has is there's a normal pregnancy test in there, so the two-line pregnancy test.
Right.
And the image sensor reads this test and then basically gives you a visual cue if you're pregnant or not. And it kind of makes sense because it's a very stressful environment. You never really understand, like, is it one line or is it two lines when I'm
Right.
pregnant? That kind of thing. Now, they took that chip, which powers all of this, and looked up what the compute power of that chip is. And that chip has the exact same compute power as the original IBM PC, which kicked off the PC revolution. And for me, this is an interesting weak signal
And
because
it's clearly a disposable chip that is
that's the
sourced
point.
for how many pennies, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And you use it once and you literally throw it into the bin.
Right.
And for me, this is an interesting weak signal because it points towards that we're moving into a world where compute not just becomes abundant, but truly ambient. It's just there. And then the question for me becomes, again, as an entrepreneur or a leader, you want to ask yourself the question, what could I do with the compute power of an IBM PC
Right.
in a, like in a chip which costs God knows what, $1 or something?
Yeah. Right. Right. Or that. Well, and then since we're talking about life sciences and chips, we start saying what happens when we start to integrate things like, and then
Hmm.
we use this as a stepping off point, such as computing and biology. Because if you take a look, for example, at some of the early work using DNA as a storage medium, despite the massive amounts of data that we're generating right now, if you could actually use DNA as a storage medium, what is it? Something like a carry-on suitcase could contain all of the data that exists and all of the storage mechanisms globally right now. So our ability to continue to drive that exponential change, I mean, we're still in the early days as advanced as we think we are.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Spot on.
So, what are some things, since you help people see around the corners, you're looking at all of these emerging technologies. We're hearing about, about continuing major advancements in autonomy and artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics. And we flip over to the biology side or the chemistry side with on-demand manufacturing. What are some of these convergences that you find most fascinating that are in not just that possible but probable zone of what may be next?
You know, the interesting thing is a lot of them actually you can see already, and I think they are somewhat debated and discussed. For me, if you look at the different areas, you've got anything from compute. Again, for me, the interesting thing around compute is um, the notion that compute becomes ambient, that it's just literally everywhere. And then there's this famous saying from Andrew Ng who says that AI becomes the new electricity. And I think a lot of people like say this, but they don't really understand what he means. And for me, at least, the interpretation of this is to say that everything got a little bit better when we put AI, when we put electricity in it, right? Like your toothbrush, literally your toothbrush gets better when you turn it into an electric toothbrush.
Right.
And the exact same thing will happen with AI. It gets a little bit like we will put AI into everything and it will make it marginally better, but just a little bit better. And it will change in some, will change our lives. So you've got all of this happening. Then you've got the massive advances we're doing in the field of synthetic biology and genetics.
So let me just pause there for just for 10 seconds and then let's move on. I mean, AI is being essentially what I'm hearing you saying is AI is being democratized. It used to be something that only Watson at IBM or something else could do, but now we're starting to see it filter down and potentially be as ubiquitous as electricity, which means if we spread it just a little bit into a lot of things, the cumulative function is going to fundamentally change the way we interact with one another, with machines, with everything else. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And then you
Okay.
add to that, all the effects we've been having and studying in Silicon Valley for, decades, like Metcalfe's laws, right? Like
Right.
the law of networks, like you start connecting all these things and it becomes truly transformative.
Yeah. Who knew Moore's law would still be in effect from Intel, right? Talking about
Mhm.
those types of things. Absolutely. Um, so move on. You were talking about biology and synthetic
Yeah,
biology. So
totally. Yeah,
what do
you
we
look
see
at
there?
synthetic. Yeah, totally. You look at synthetic biology, and you start like seeing, for example, the steepest price decline in any technology we've ever seen, where you go from $2 billion to sequence a human genome in the
Right.
1990s to about $1,000 today, and like
Right.
soon roughly $100. And now it's a thing we do at the doctor's office. Like we regularly sequence genomes, which is crazy if you would
Right.
have
Right.
told us like 10 years ago to someone, right?
And you can get it for your dog or
Yes,
whatever. Now
yeah,
they have
exactly. Talking about the weak signals, right? It's
right.
like you get it for your dog.
Yeah.
Um, you look in that field, you look into things like the microbiome, so all the bacteria which make up your body, which aren't you,
Right.
where like in terms of just sheer genetic material, that is significantly more than you are actually. So we are more
Yeah. So
than.
what might we do with some of so with the
Mm,
capable? So for me, the fascinating thing is, especially at Berkeley, where we are, and all the research that goes on, I see all this amazing science.
mhm,
We're sometimes we still have challenges jumping from the lab into
totally.
commercialization. Sometimes we just pursue knowledge, and there's elements of what we're talking about. But then when you start to, the entrepreneur and the innovator starts to put these pieces together in interesting ways, what might be some of the implications of some of the things you're talking about?
I'm particularly fascinated. I know nothing about this, so I'm just getting super fascinated as an amateur, person on the sidewalk looking at it. But Hannah Tucker wrote a really beautiful report on the future of food, and she talks about how in the future we will create very likely a bioprocessor, a fermentation process, which creates essentially meat and meat-like products in steelless tanks.
Right.
Now, if you think about, and this is where it gets really interesting for me, is like, So you've got this as a breakthrough, and if you're in the meat industry, that might be interesting to you. But
And we already
I
see parts of that, right? With
totally
Impossible Foods and Beyond
100%.
Meat, right? And 3D printed steaks. So now, if you're in the meat industry, go ahead.
Yeah, like the thing which I get excited about is I like to think about what are the implications of the implication? Like, what are the outer edges of those
Right.
implications? And if you think about, say, for example, we can actually create, say, meat in a stainless steel tank through a fermentation process. Now, suddenly, I can probably do this in much smaller quantities, much closer to the consumer. So that has then suddenly a ripple-on effect on the transportation industry because I don't need to put cattle into big
Right.
transporters and drive them across the country. That might have then also effects on the land use. So suddenly, like all this cattle land use we are now using for other purposes. So there's these interesting ripple effects at the outer edges, and the disruption happens there. It doesn't happen in your field of vision.
Okay, so this is where, as we kind of start to wind down this conversation, I'd love to keep going forever on this one,
Totally.
but this is where you say, however the expression goes, a butterfly beats its wings,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure you feel it. It creates a storm halfway around the world. So advances in synthetic biology, the ability to actually create artificial meat, are going to have profound implications for real estate, are going to have profound
Mm-hmm.
implications for transportation and logistics,
Mm-hmm.
the way we distribute. So, and it's those nonlinear kinds of connections that are going to keep all of us up at night saying, okay, how do we do that? Because the way you just connected those dots are what we want to be thinking about to look around the curve. If I'm a real estate investor, it doesn't just mean that I can look at the price of land. I need to think about its best use and what else is happening for it with it.
That's exactly right. And again, like the mental model is actually pretty easy to do once you train yourself to
Yeah.
do this, is to look at, we typically stop at the first level of implications, right? You say like, I don't know, autonomous vehicles. I give you an example. Autonomous vehicles lead to less accidents. And most people stop there and just accept it.
Right.
Some people start asking, what are the implications of that? And you come to like things like, well, insurance rates will change.
Right.
If you happen to be in the business of doing car repairs, your business
Right.
might go away.
Right.
Here's an interesting one. So one of the implications might be less accidents lead to less people dying on the road, which is great. So that has an influence on probably our health insurance costs, et
Right.
cetera. But here's another one. And this is where you get into the outer edges of this. And this comes from a colleague of mine called Paul Roberts. He looked at this and said, well, if less people die, we have less organ donors, because unfortunately, most organ donors are kids driving themselves to death,
Right.
right, in cars. So if you have less organ donors, what are the implications of that? And then you can get into like, yeah, of course, they get into the space where like, some illustrious entrepreneurs will think that the market for the black market for organs might go up. Um, Better-minded entrepreneurs will think about, okay, do we need to invest into growing organs in petri dishes?
Well, that's just it. Can we grow organs now? I mean, coming
Exactly.
out of Israel recently, 3D printed hearts with organic materials.
Yes,
So all of a
exactly.
sudden, do we no longer need those organ donors, or at least
Hmm.
in some instances? Fascinating stuff. All right,
Yes.
maybe one or two other, if you have some examples. I love the nonlinear elements, which is kind of where we came in on this. I don't know if you have some thoughts of one or two more things you would just really want to share. And then I'd like to wrap up by asking you with a couple of takeaways in the way we might
Mm.
rewire our thinking a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So one or two. One which has been debated much, but I think people still don't understand the implications fully, is the move towards renewable energy, probably particularly solar. We are now seeing, and again, talking about the weak signals, Qatar, the country,
Mm-hmm.
has just issued a 800 megawatt tender for an 800 megawatt solar powered facility, which was won by a French conglomerate. And this is without any subsidies and amortized over a typical lifespan of a utility scale facility, so about 25 years or so, for less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour, $2 a kilowatt hour. So
Yeah.
energy becomes incredibly cheap. Now, that is one side, and this is clean energy, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
The other side, again, like to this point, like what are the implications of this? One of them is, if you think about the countries with the most sunshine hours today, so the countries where you harvest sun power in the most efficient way, they tend to be the poorest countries around the world. Like think Africa,
Hmm.
right? So there might be an interesting shift in geopolitics coming from the fact that we're moving towards renewable energy and solar in this case.
In other words, moving from natural resources that we would think of, coal, oil,
Mm-hmm.
precious metals, things like that. Now you're saying we have constantly renewable resources in many of these poor areas. Can they become net energy exporters in a fundamentally
Mm-hmm.
different way? I think is the implication of where you're going.
Yeah, and again, like you see an interesting weak signal. I've spent some time in Iceland. Iceland has a geothermal energy and an abundance of it. So it's a
Hmm.
clean source of energy, which mostly comes out of the fact that they're volcanic, stronger volcanic activity there. They are now one of the largest producer of aluminum smeltering. They're not producing the aluminum, they're smelter. So
Right.
because it is cheaper for us to ship aluminum in massive ships to Iceland, have it smeltered there, which requires a ton of energy. It's really
Right.
expensive to do, and then ship the raw aluminum bars, whatever they look like. I have no idea, but ship those back
Right.
into the countries instead of smeltering in country where I do actually the aluminum mining.
Right.
So
But
again,
if
like
you,
an interesting indication here.
which is really fascinating, but so that's disrupting the metals industry, aluminum for
Mhm.
industry right now. But if we go back to your prior comment, if electricity can then be produced and then efficiently transmitted around the world as a energy source, that fundamentally changes everything and makes it back to local again. So
Correct.
these are two fundamentally conflicting trends,
Mhm.
and there's not one that's right or one that's wrong. They just are.
Talking about the cone of uncertainty, right?
Yeah,
This is where you
exactly.
like now you go into the future and say what are the scenarios? Ultimately, it's scenario planning, right? Like what are the scenarios? What are the likelihoods of scenarios? And again, we've been doing this for like decades. It's not a
Right.
new science, but somehow we tend to forget about it.
Well, and we traditionally, especially in planning, when we think about planning, planning is incredibly linear.
Mhm.
Planning is based on history. And here we're talking about not having the history or the history that we can really look to. So, how do we have to? So, as we wrap up, recommendations to us as business executives, as entrepreneurs, as government leaders, kind of,
Mhm.
if there was something we might think about rewiring in the way we do this, kind of what you teach, what would you recommend to us?
I think the simplest version I can give you is this. I would become very curious about the world. I would particularly look out for changes which aren't in your industry. Because again, like typically people who are in an industry know everything there is to know about the industry. Otherwise, you shouldn't be in that industry.
Right.
Um, Looking for those changes which aren't in your industry, like the pregnancy test we talked about, and then asking yourself a question which I learned from Guy Kawasaki, who was the first evangelist over at Apple
Yeah,
back
and
in the
Guy's a good friend
80s.
of mine. Yeah.
Incredible human being. And he taught me this question, which is go through your life and ask yourself, isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Because that question opens up a whole line of inquisition and questioning. Whereas very often we look at something, like most people will look at that pregnancy test and they say like curiously, yeah, whatever, it's interesting, like someone has done it, so what? But if you ask, isn't that interesting? You will come to the question of, hey, wait a second, what can I do with that chip, which cost me $1? And if I put that into a whole different context?
Right, right. That's more the element of not the eureka, I found it, but it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
the slow hunch. It's you're looking for something and you don't quite find what you're looking for. And you're right. And then you tug that a little more and you say, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that
Okay. So
a
that's
friend of
what,
mine called this the drunken walk of the entrepreneur?
yeah,
Right, there's no straight line.
yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's kind of another friend. We're talking about our friends. I don't know if that's a metaphor, right? Calls it zigzag entrepreneurship, where
Mm-hmm.
it's not a straight line, where you're bouncing off the walls, kind of looking in the corners for what these changes are. All right. So for those who are watching, saying, how do we look around the corners? From how do we move from the possible into the probable? Let's rewire our thinking a little bit. I think one of the key things for me that's super important, and then turn to you for our last word, is just consuming a lot of information, having fascinating conversations like this, because And this is where we as humans really, we're still ahead of the machines here, because you can create these nonlinear associations and say, what if these things come together? And the beauty is then we can make those happen. And I think as innovators, as change makers, that's what we want to do. That's my final 2 cents. Your final 2 cents?
So my final 2 cents, Mark, I just want to underline what you just said, and I'll probably add another point to that, which is I recently read a report talking about where do the next true breakthroughs come from. And the argument was made very strongly that they will not come out of a singular area, expertise, technology, because we've done that. We have
Right.
exploited this. The next breakthroughs truly will come out of people combining multiple sectors, multiple ideas, multiple technologies. To your point earlier, what happens if we bring together synthetic biology, AI, compute power, free energy? That is where the next breakthroughs come. And that requires us to look beyond the horizon and not just stay deep in our domain.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. Look to the horizon, look beyond it, look at where these come together. Pascal, what a great conversation. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.